Every semester, students have the same question. Dr. Schultz, what exactly are you looking for in this response to quotes assignment? And the answer is complicated. However, it's not complicated because I have this innate need to have hold power over you. The reason it's complicated is because in teaching you how to get better at this, I'm also teaching you how to think critically about what you read. So let's start with some things that I don't expect you to do in this assignment. Number one, I don't want you to write like you already know everything. Even if you feel like you have a good grasp, I like you to write in a voice that is tentative, in a voice that shows me that you are learning new things and that you're open to the possibility that the words the author has put down on paper might teach you something that you did not already know. When you go into it trying to sound like an authority, you miss out on some opportunities for learning. Number two, I don't expect you to respond to the entire article. That's kind of what your summary does. It takes little pieces across the entire article and puts them together in a condensed form. Okay, number three, don't choose quotes that only contain information with which you are already very familiar. This one's a little confusing. Educational theory, schema theory, teaches us that you want to make connections between new information and information that already exists in your brain. However, if you already know so much about a particular quote, you don't have anywhere to go. In your writing, you're going to be simply rehashing something and reinforcing something that you already know a lot about. So choose a quote that you may know a little bit about, but make sure that there's room for you to do some writing and do some exploring about concepts that are unfamiliar to you in that quote. Okay, let's talk about the things that you do need to do for this assignment. Number one, steer clear of overly simple quotes. Choose ones that are what I call power-packed. That means they need to be unpacked like a suitcase. There's lots of complicated and complex ideas, new ideas for you, things that you're able to explore and ask questions about so that you can learn some new information about our course questions. Number two, do more than summarize. And we've already talked about how the first part of this assignment prior to responding to a quote is the summarization piece of it. It would be acceptable to start out by summarizing what you do understand about the quote, what it's said to you. But then I want you to expand your response by asking a question, sounding tentative, possibly using your monitoring by rereading or reading ahead to answer questions that you have about the quote. You can attack an individual word. You can even synthesize and try to make sense of the quote by connecting a piece of the quote with something that you already know in order to illuminate what this quote is trying to teach you about the concept. Number three, be sure your exploration, your response to the quote, answers one of our course questions. In the very beginning, students make this mistake quite often because they get caught up in reading the article and they find a great quote, but then they forget to go back and make sure the quote addresses the course question that we're focusing on for that particular article. For example, if they're reading an article on fluency and it just happens to mention phonics, they choose the quote about phonics and then sort of get what I call adrift, and they are exploring a topic that isn't necessarily germane to the course question we're trying to answer at that point in time. The caveat with this part of my advice is the quote does not have to directly answer a course question. You have a little bit of room to move. As long as the quote that you've chosen and the exploration that you're about to do in writing lends information that will then help you better understand what that course question is asking. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room in there. The quote doesn't have to directly answer it, but it does have to lend some information that will help you eventually answer that course question. Number four, apply what you learn from a quote to your tutoring, field experience, or teaching. I usually don't see this happen until later in the semester, so I wanted to try bringing it up earlier to let you think about it and sort of try it out earlier on. When you learn something new from a quote, a great way to think critically about it is to make a connection between this new idea and something that you've seen or experienced out in the field. When you're able to do this, you've connected theory to practice, and this is what we are all trying to do, is to make sense of the theoretical ideas and make them work for us in the real world of teaching. Number 5, write like you think, using the word I often. Students resist this every semester because I think, all the teachers in your past have convinced you that you're not supposed to use I and you're supposed to sound like an authority figure, but this is a learning journal. It's a place for you to explore ideas, and in order to do that, in order to explore them in a very personal way, it's very necessary to use the word I and to talk about what kinds of things are going through your brain, how you're processing this language. So next I'm going to show you some examples of responses from the past, some that have been successful and some that have not been successful, so that you can get a very specific idea of what kind of writing you can do in order to be successful with this assignment. Here's a quote from an article that was about teaching your students to understand textbooks like social studies and such. The progression from teacher-directed to student-directed learning is essential for developing independence and comprehension. Okay, decent quote, addresses the course question about comprehension in the content areas, and here's what this was part of her response to the quote. Reading for comprehension would have been a great lesson to have learned through guided practice as a young student. It seems that me and many of my classmates still face problems with it at times that should have been cleared up years ago, rather than teachers assuming we knew things and moving on. Okay, the positive is that the student did synthesize. She connected with her experiences in school and her ability to comprehend. However, I don't really feel that this kind of synthesizing helps you to grow, because you're simply reflecting on something that happened in the past without using that experience as a springboard to learning new things. If she had extended the response and said, and as a result of this quote, I went back and learned that I could have done X, Y, and Z as a student to help my comprehension, that kind of response would have been productive, because the memory of being in high school and not being able to comprehend would have led to an exploration of those particular ideas that would then help her improve her own comprehension and help her future students as well. Here's another example. The quote is, "The best way of learning most skills appears to be to observe others performing them." This was from the same article, and the response was, "I chose this quote as most informative because I believe it is highly important for students to directly see skills performed. This is definitely necessary for a student who learns best by seeing the whole picture first. Seeing one given example helps students in all subjects. Sometimes a student just doesn't understand until she sees the task performed. Having someone give an example of exactly what they expect tremendously helps me in understanding where I should start and how to conclude a task." The first thing I noticed about the quote itself is that it doesn't even mention reading. This is more of an idea associated with scaffolding. What I know about this particular student who responded in this way is that she had just studied multiple intelligences and learning styles, and she was very bodily kinesthetic in her learning style. So what she was doing with this quote was spending time rehearsing things that she already knew. I think this happens because it was a comfort zone for her. This quote resonated with her and made sense, so she responded to something with which she was already very familiar, instead of finding a quote that would teach her something absolutely brand new about reading and comprehension in content area classrooms. Here's another. This is a very complex quote. "In using repeated references, students' attention is directed to the surface structure of the passage, but using generalization emphasizes that the thesis or major supporting idea may not be written on the page. The reader can put two and two together to make sense of the passage. Now listen to how tentative this student sounds in her writing. She uses the word I. I didn't quite understand this cues to text-based importance idea at first. From the quote, I understood that repeated references are skimming the surface of the text in search of something that the author mentions over and over. But when it came to generalization, I was a little confused. I understood that when forming generalizations, students actually have to connect with the text while at the same time connecting the text to themselves. Then I thought of synthesizing and how it could be connected to generalization and summarization. What I want you to see here, you may not understand all of this yet because we haven't really studied it formally, but I want you to see that she was tentative. She said, I don't really understand this yet. She reread it, she talked about it some more, and then she tried to make a connection to a piece of our reading content that she did understand. And she used that piece to help her try to understand this new content. That's effective.